while we're waiting, would you like to introduce you and yourself and the Senator's team?
Happy to. This is Carl Mitcha. I am State Director for Senator Cruz. I'm based here in Texas, down in Austin, and have worked with a lot of the chambers around the state for a number of years now, first with the UT system and now as State Director for Senator Cruz. Been with him for about almost 6 years now. We've got Christine Babcock on the line, who is our North Texas Regional Director, and her Deputy Regional Director, Michael Flushy, is on as well, and Sydney Long, who is our Constituent Outreach Liaison there in the Dallas office as well. So, and then Samara Brown is our legislative aide who works on issues that y'all wanted to address today. She's on as well. So
great, thank you very much.
Always happy to hear from y'all and hear how we can be of assistance to the local business community. The main focus is jobs, freedom, and security, and jobs are y'all's main focus there in Richardson as well. So we're happy to try and help out any way we can through DC and by keeping DC out of the mix sometimes.
I think the Senator's joined us. There he is.
There he is.
Good. Senator Cruz, welcome. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you.
I understand that you're in between votes.
We are, so I'm going to have to run and vote in a little bit.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you for spending some time with us today. I was just reflecting that you and I had a lot darker hair when we first met back in 2013, and you were our keynote speaker at our annual meeting.
Well, it has been an interesting journey since then, to put it mildly.
Well, you drew a record crowd as a freshman U.S. Senator, and we thank you for that.
Well, I was glad to be there then and glad to be here now.
So I've got some prepared questions, but I just wanted to give you a chance to make some remarks, to a business audience that, knows you and Texans, and what's on your mind?
Well, look, right now, these are really challenging times. Number one, we're coming out of a year that has been unlike any year any of us have ever experienced. We've had a global pandemic. We've seen the economy shut down all across the country. And between the public health challenges and the economic challenges, it has been really a very, very, very difficult time. The good news on that is we seem to be coming out of both of those. That with the vaccine, I think it is extraordinary. I think we all should be grateful at the innovation from the pharmaceutical companies in developing the vaccine on a warp speed timing, and grateful also for the leadership of the Trump administration reducing the regulatory burdens so that that vaccine could be developed so quickly. I think as more and more Texans, more and more Americans get the vaccine, we're moving closer and closer to the point of herd immunity that we want to get to, where the pandemic will be behind us. We're not quite there yet, but we're plainly moving in the right direction. That's very encouraging. On the economic side, I think we're seeing businesses opening up. We're seeing the economy coming back, roaring back. I think most Texans in dealing with this pandemic wanted to see us follow common sense. So I think most Texans understood this is a serious disease. It's an infectious disease for those, particularly those in vulnerable populations, either the very elderly or those with serious pre-existing health conditions. It could be a fatal disease, and I think most of us have used common sense and reasonable precautions to try to slow the spread of the disease. That being said, I think Texans also want to be able to go to work, want to be able to open up their businesses, want to be able to provide for their families. And I think we have seen in the approaches different states have taken to this, we have seen models that don't work. The model of California and New York of just mandating massive closures of small businesses and keeping them closed over and over and over again, I think is extreme. I think it is causing millions of Americans enormous financial hardship. And I think it's wrong. And I think most Texans wanted a reasonable balance where we take common sense precautions, but we still allow people to open their businesses, allow customers to go to stores and restaurants, have our kids back in school. If you look nationally, only about 40% of school kids nationally are back in school in person 5 days a week. I think that's an absolute outrage. Millions of kids across this country are falling behind, and falling behind badly at this point. We're talking about over a year that many kids have been out of school, and the kids are falling behind in reading and in writing and arithmetic and history and science and art and music, not to mention socially, as we're dealing with greater instances of depression and mental illness and challenges in the household for parents that have kids at home and have issues with childcare and themselves being able to work. So I think where we ought to be going towards is fighting the pandemic, opening businesses, and having kids back in school. Most Texans, I believe, agree with that. Beyond that, in Washington, listen, this is a crazy time in Washington. We have total Democratic control of the federal government. And between Biden, Pelosi, and Schumer, we're seeing a really, I think, extreme and dangerous agenda being forced on the country. It is an agenda that is very, very different from the platform Joe Biden campaigned on. He campaigned as a unifier. He campaigned as a moderate. That has not been how he has governed. Instead, we have seen this administration handing decision-making over to the extreme left wing of the party. I think that's very damaging. And I think Texas is going to have a challenging several years ahead of us with policies that are going to hurt jobs and business creation in the state of Texas. And my number one priority is jobs. I think Texans want jobs. We want to go to work. The way to have jobs is to have low taxes and low regulations in an environment where entrepreneurs can put capital at risk. Instead, we're facing an environment where the regulations are getting much, much more onerous, where taxes are getting ready to rise dramatically, and all of that is going to hurt Texas families. It's going to hurt jobs. It's going to hurt Texas job creators. And so I'm going to do my best every day to fight for 29 million Texans, to fight for lots of jobs, to fight for our freedom, to fight for our security. And I think all of those are seriously imperiled right now. With that, Bill, why don't we open it up to questions?
Sure. So, Senator, let me start with the infrastructure package. As you know, the Biden administration has proposed close to a $2 trillion package. There was a bipartisan group of senators that have proposed an amount quite a bit less. I think it was 500 some odd million. What are your thoughts about what's going to happen in the Senate on the infrastructure package, and what will be your position on it?
So I think there is a lot of potential for a bipartisan infrastructure package. Infrastructure is something that both parties want to see major investment in. I think in the previous Congress, President Trump desperately wanted an infrastructure package. The reason it didn't pass is congressional Democrats were unwilling to work with him on it. Where we are today, the Biden, quote, infrastructure proposal is an extreme partisan bill. It's $2.6 trillion, which even in federal government terms is a massive amount of money. It includes massive tax increases on corporations and job creators. And most of it is in infrastructure. You know, we saw earlier this year, the first big bill that passed through the Congress with the new majorities was called a COVID relief bill. It was $1.9 trillion. It was called COVID relief, but only 9% of the bill was actually healthcare spending on COVID. 91% was not. And it included essentially payoffs to special interests who had backed congressional Democrats. And it passed as a hard partisan bill. Not a single Republican in the House voted for it. Not a single Republican in the Senate voted for it. And it's worth underscoring, COVID relief, it would have been easy to do a bipartisan bill on COVID relief. And Bill, I'll point out that look, talk's cheap and actions speak louder than words. Last year, when Republicans had the majority, we passed 5 bipartisan COVID relief bills. We demonstrated you can roll up your sleeves, work with the opposing party, and particularly on something like COVID relief, get it done. If Biden had been willing to come together and put together a COVID relief package that is focused on vaccines, that is focused on healthcare, that is focused on helping schools open up, we could easily have reached a bill that would have gotten 95 or more votes in the Senate. They decided instead to do a hard partisan bill. On infrastructure, the same thing is true. That $2.6 trillion monstrosity, the COVID relief bill, only 9% of it was healthcare spending on COVID. The infrastructure bill, 5% of it is roads and bridges. The reason they call it infrastructure is that infrastructure is popular. Most of us care about roads and bridges. We want to see investments into roads and bridges. They're important for economic growth, but only 5% of the bill is roads and bridges. There's $400 billion in the quote infrastructure bill that is Medicaid spending. Now look, Medicaid serves a purpose. We can have a debate about Medicaid spending, but it ain't infrastructure. Medicaid is not a bridge. And this is just a political shell game to call Medicaid infrastructure. You mentioned there's a bipartisan proposal. I think on a Republican side, you could certainly find a number of Republicans willing to work together on infrastructure if Biden and Schumer and Pelosi are willing to do so. One challenge is always how you pay for it. The Democrats' answer is raise taxes, and we're going to see taxes raised. We're going to see corporate taxes raised. We're going to see individual taxes raised. We're going to see taxes on pass-throughs and small businesses raised. We're going to see the death tax raised. We're going to see capital gains raised. All of those taxes are going up, and they're going to go up a lot this year. I think the natural way to pay for infrastructure is to use the unspent hundreds of billions of dollars from the so-called COVID relief bill that has spending going into 8-10 years in the future. Use that money to invest in infrastructure. If you did that, you'd get most, if not every Republican on board to say, let's use the unspent money to actually invest in real infrastructure, in roads and bridges and airports and things that are everyone recognizes as infrastructure. I think the Republican side would eagerly participate in that. Right now, I'm seeing very little indication that Biden, Schumer, and Pelosi want to do that.
Where do you see some opportunities in the Senate for true bipartisan legislation? I mean, a lot of times, bills pass the Senate or the Congress with 80% or more support. There's a water bill, for instance, out there right now that looks like it's got broad support. Are you seeing examples like that of broad bipartisan support for different bills?
Yeah, there may be some of that. I mentioned last year we had 5 major bipartisan COVID relief bills. So we worked together in that regard. Last week in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, we voted out a big bill dealing with China that got wide bipartisan support. It included a number of amendments that I introduced that were added to it that got overwhelming bipartisan support, focusing on going after China and some of their excesses. So I think there are areas where we can see some bipartisan cooperation, but it takes a willingness on the part of the administration to do it. I have characterized the first 100 days of Joe Biden's presidency in 3 words: boring, but radical, which is, in terms of tone and temperament, I think Joe Biden has made a decision consciously to be really boring. And I think that's probably smart politics, that after 4 years of Donald Trump waking up every day with what did he say today? What did he tweet today? And having the news of every day driven by whatever he said that given day, I think there are a lot of Americans that were a little weary about that. You think of the last 100 days, it's hard to think of anything Joe Biden said. I mean, he's sort of deliberately doesn't make news, is quiet. And I think they made the political judgment that if he's sort of the ambling, absent-minded grandfather, that's innocuous and not very threatening. But that's been combined with an agenda on substance that is really extreme. They have made the decision that the agenda will be driven by Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and AOC, by the extreme left. So, for example, capital gains. They're coming out this week with a massive increase in capital gains taxes, doubling the capital gains taxes that people pay. In New York City, capital gains taxes would be nearly 60%. I think 58 point something percent is what you would pay on capital gains. Now, that is uniquely stupid in 2 regards. Number one, we're coming out of a recession from this pandemic where we need people to go back to work, and putting massive disincentives for investment is directly counter to the objective of creating jobs and getting people back to work. But number two, and this is the thing that's crazy, Bill, capital gains taxes, the data show that when you raise capital gains tax rates, particularly when you raise them a lot, federal tax revenue goes down. And as you understand, that's because capital gains taxes, realizing capital gains is discretionary. You don't have to realize capital gains. And so when you jack up the rate, what happens is people don't realize the gains, and they leave the gains either in a stock or bond, or they leave it in real estate or a business or a farm or a ranch, and they don't sell it. And what happens is trillions of dollars of capital are just frozen because the tax rate's too high. People never realize the gain. That means they don't. If you could sell that stock, if you could sell that real estate, you would use the proceeds to then go and invest in another business, to hire people, to create jobs. You jack up the capital gains rates, people stop selling things, and everything gets frozen, and the federal revenue goes down. And this is an example where if we were engaged in common sense, why would you want to destroy investment and reduce federal tax revenues? It is because it's the radical left that's driving the agenda.
Capitalism requires the turnover of capital in order to generate income. I understand. You mentioned, Senator, you mentioned foreign policy, and I know you've got to go vote, but I wanted you to hit on that. You serve on the Committee on Foreign Relations. There are some big issues out there that we're facing, threats from China. Putin seems really aggressive in, Ukraine and the Crimea.
Yep.
We're trying to re-engage with the Europeans, all sorts of things. What do you see as the 2 or 3 big issues that we need to address and that you'll see coming through the Committee on Foreign Relations?
There are lots of issues, but if I were to identify a couple, I'd say China, Russia, and Iran. China, I think China poses the single greatest geopolitical threat to the United States over the next century. China has massive economic force, and they are engaged in global espionage, global theft of intellectual property, that they are engaged in global blackmail of our friends and allies, trying to further their interests. They are engaged in aggressive military buildup. They are testing hostile weaponry to destroy our satellites in space. And in the Senate, I have been leading the charge in standing up to communist China. I've introduced over a dozen different pieces of legislation focusing on different aspects of China, whether it is sanctioning them for their cover-up that led to the spread of the Wuhan pandemic globally, where the Chinese Communist government arrested and disappeared whistleblowers, heroic Chinese doctors and journalists trying to highlight the outbreak in Wuhan. Instead, they were put in jail. And I have legislation to sanction the Chinese government officials that covered this up and contributed it to it becoming a global pandemic. Pressing back on Hong Kong and the brutal crackdown on Hong Kong. Taiwan, you mentioned, I actually just had a victory last week in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So under the Obama administration, the State Department implemented a policy that Taiwan could not display their symbols of sovereignty. They couldn't display the Taiwanese flag. They couldn't have a Taiwanese military in a Taiwanese uniform on federal government property. And that was a policy designed to appease communist China. When Donald Trump got elected, I urged the State Department to change that policy to allow Taiwan to display its flag and its soldiers to wear their military uniform. And President Trump agreed with me. And so we changed that policy and allowed Taiwan to display their symbols of sovereignty. When Joe Biden got elected, I asked Tony Blinken, the new Secretary of State, he committed before the Senate that he would maintain the Trump policy of allowing Taiwan to display their symbols. Then, unfortunately, a couple of weeks ago, the State Department reneged on that deal. They backed out and they implemented the old policy of no symbols of sovereignty, presumably because they wanted to appease communist China. Last week on the China bill we had before Senate Foreign Relations, I introduced an amendment to return to the Trump policy of allowing Taiwan to display their flags and their uniforms, passed unanimously. Every Democrat, every Republican agreed to it. So that's Standing up to China is a big, big priority. We also need to be looking at our supply chain. We need to be looking at censorship. All of those are big challenges. Russia, this is another area where there's been big bipartisan agreement, in particular dealing with Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 is a natural gas pipeline that's being constructed from Russia to Germany. It's about 95% complete. A year and a half ago, I introduced legislation to sanction the companies building the pipeline. That legislation got overwhelming bipartisan support, passed into law, and it halted the pipeline like that. Literally, the day the legislation was signed, they stopped constructing the pipeline because it would have bankrupted the companies if they kept doing it. For a year, that pipeline lay dormant. Nothing happened on it. And the beauty of it is a 95% complete pipeline is a 0% complete pipeline. It's a hunk of metal at the bottom of the ocean till you finish it. Joe Biden gets elected in November, and weeks later, Russia begins building the pipeline again because Russia believes the Biden administration won't follow the law, won't impose sanctions against the companies building the pipeline. Putin is trying to ram through this pipeline in the next few months. I have been leading the fight in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to stop it and to point out that we've seen massive bipartisan agreement in Congress that we should stop this pipeline. Stopping the pipeline is a victory for Europe, it's a victory for America, and it's a loss to Putin. If the pipeline gets built, Putin will get billions of dollars of revenue. It makes Europe more dependent on economic blackmail on the US, economic blackmail from Russia, and it also hurts Texas producers. Look, if Putin isn't supplying energy, it means Texas producers and American producers can be supplying low-cost energy to our friends and allies there. So that's an area where we've seen big victories, but it's still open it up in the air whether the Biden administration will turn victory into defeat because they seem to be squandering this moment.
It's beyond me how the Europeans and particularly the Germans would ever trust Russia on that pipeline and why they would want to, frankly, tie themselves, make themselves dependent upon that supply of gas when there's all sorts of alternatives. And it's just confounding.
It is, and Angela Merkel seems hell-bent on trying to get this pipeline completed. Most of Europe understands it's a mistake. The European Parliament voted something like 400 and something to 100 and something to condemn Nord Stream 2. So Europe as a whole understands this is really bad for Europe. But Merkel and Putin seem really bound and determined. I'm told from some friends who have traveled to Germany that I'm right now public enemy #1 in the newspapers there because it's my bill that shut this pipeline down, which is Putin's top priority there. I'm okay with that. It's a big victory for American foreign policy and American jobs. A final foreign policy issue that's going to be a big challenge over the next 4 years is Iran. I think Biden's #1 foreign policy objective is to get back into the failed Obama-Iran nuclear deal that sent over $100 billion to the Ayatollah Khamenei, who chants death to America and death to Israel. President Trump pulled out of that deal. I urged him vociferously to do so. I think it was the most important foreign policy decision of the Trump administration, and Joe Biden seems bound and determined to send billions of dollars back to terrorists who want to kill us. That you're not going to see bipartisan cooperation on. You're going to see a sharp partisan divide. I think it's really foolish and dangerous, and I think it endangers Israel. Bibi Netanyahu passionately agrees, thinks it has described a nuclear Iran as an existential threat to Israel, and it also endangers America. And so I hope the Biden administration doesn't go down this road, but I'm concerned about where they're going. And I will say, unfortunately, I was just handed a note that says 0 left in vote and cloakroom called, which means I've got to run to the floor now and vote.
Well, I want to thank you for spending time with us. You've always been gracious to receive us there in DC in person. We're always happy to have you come here and visit. So hopefully we'll see each other in person sometime soon.
I look forward to it. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate it. And with that, folks, thank Carl and your staff for being with us. You're more than welcome to stay on the call if you'd like. We've got Mr. Kirk Burgee with the Federal Communications Commission talking to us next. and he's already joined us, and Barbara Baffer of Erickson is going to take over that. But any final words, Carl?
Yes, sir. I just wanted to say, if y'all got any questions, feel free to circle back with Michael Flushy. He sent a message out to everybody in the chat on this Zoom call, and we are always happy to connect with y'all, and anything we can do in DC or here in Texas, please feel free to always reach out. Always great being with y'all.
And Michael Flushy, you're always welcome to a Young Professionals club meeting. You're just going to have to pay your own drinks these days.
I could do that much.
That'll mean he'll drink less, Bill. Y'all have a great meeting. Thanks for having us on today.
Thanks so much. I see you, Christine.
Great to see you too. Look forward to seeing you in person soon.
Very good. So, Barbara, you want to take it? Before you do that, let me just make sure and thank our sponsors for our federal policy briefings. Mr. Burgee, thank you for being so patient while we finished up with Senator Cruz. He has a little seniority in this kind of discussion, so we let him take some time. I want to thank the following companies and organizations for being our sponsors: Texas Instruments, Dallas College, the Richland campus, Atmos Energy, the City of Richardson, National Write Your Congressman, and Charter Communications. So thanks to all of them. And Barbara, I turn it over to you for the next federal policy briefing.
Great, thanks very much, and thanks for this great program. I think did we also thank TI for being our sponsor? But if we didn't, TI, thanks for being our sponsor as well.
Yeah, and Barbara,
so
we can't
we're really
see you in your video. We're seeing kind of a ceiling.
Oh,
there you are.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we'll take down the tone a little bit and talk about something that is what we can agree on. And I think we're delighted to have Kirk Burgee from the Federal Communications Commission with us today. He's the Chief of Staff of the Wireline Competition Bureau. And why this is really, I think, interesting to us as the chamber and as business leaders and as tech titans is one thing I think both Republicans and Democrats can agree on is the need for broadband for all Americans, whether in rural areas or urban areas or underserved areas. And so that's the area that Kirk is leading at the FCC. So he's going to describe different broadband programs and how the government is working to roll out broadband deployments and the different programs they have. And so with that, I'll turn to Kirk. And Kirk, thank you so much for joining us today and giving us your information about what the commission is doing to roll out broadband to all Americans.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm going to just share my screen, hopefully. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to talk today. So I am the Chief of Staff of the FCC's Wireline Competition Bureau. I'm also a Deputy Director of the FCC's Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force, which is tasked with overseeing auctions of universal service support to serve unserved and underserved areas. And I'll talk a bit about that work as we progress along. But I wanted to start with just a little bit of background. Apologies to folks who already know this, but probably the primary way that the FCC works to promote the deployment of broadband services is through its universal service programs. And here on the first slide is a summary of, there's 4 basic categories of programs. Each of them has elements within them that there's some, oops, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. Okay. So there's some complexity there, but this is basically the 4 areas that the programs work towards. The first is the high cost program, which includes the Connect America Fund, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, and the Connect America Fund Alternative Cost, Connect America Cost Model Fund. And what these programs are directed at is subsidizing the cost of deploying voice and broadband networks in areas where it is not economic to deploy those on a market basis. So we provide support so that those areas, unserved and underserved areas, can receive deployment. Those are typically rural areas, so not exclusively, but the majority of them are. The next program is the E-rate program, also called the Schools and Libraries program, and this reduces the cost of broadband for K through 12 schools and libraries. The Lifeline program is the third program that reduces the costs of voice and broadband service for low-income consumers. And finally, the Rural Healthcare Program, which, as its name implies, reduces the cost of broadband for rural healthcare providers and other entities that are in consortia with such providers, provided they qualify. So that's just kind of an overview. I'm going to be talking mostly about the high-cost programs. But before I do that, I just wanted to mention some of the other programs that we are working that are outside of the Universal Service Fund program and that have been recently initiated as a result of legislation that was passed either last year or this year. The first of these is the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, which is a $3.2 billion program to support broadband services and devices to low-income households so that they can stay connected during the COVID-19 pandemic. On a very basic level, it will offer $50 discount off the cost of service and a $100 discount on certain connected devices, provided the terms of the program are met. The COVID-19 telehealth program, this is round 2 of that program. The first version of that program was initiated in April of 2020 under the CARES Act, which was passed more recently. Congress appropriated an additional $295 million for that program, which supports efforts of healthcare providers to address the coronavirus by providing funding for telecommunication services, information services, and devices as necessary to enable the provision of services during the pandemic. So it's the same program, another $295 million to administer through that program. The first phase of the program, first round, was a $200 million budget. And the Emergency Connectivity Fund, this is a $7.17 billion funding for eligible schools and libraries for the purchase of eligible equipment and advanced telecommunications and information services for use by students, school staff, and library patrons at locations other than a school or library. And so that's significant because the FCC's E-rate program, as it's currently constituted, does not provide funding for services that are not physically on the premises of a school or a library. So this Emergency Connectivity Fund operates in conjunction or complements the E-rate program from that standpoint. Each of these is relatively early in the process. We're moving very quickly to get these up and going as soon as we can. The one that's probably the furthest along is the COVID-19 telehealth round 2 program, which has established has established a filing window for applications for funding from that program it will open on Thursday, April 29, and close on May 6. So that is the non-USF, main non-USF programs that we are currently working on. And so that takes us to a little more detail on some of what we're doing on the high cost front. In 2018, the FCC conducted the Connect America Phase 2 auction. This was significant in that it was the first reverse auction of universal service support for the deployment of fixed voice and broadband capable networks. As a reverse auction, it was the idea behind it was to introduce competition into high cost universal service support. So historically, those support in the high cost program had gone to incumbent telephone companies and competitive telephone companies. In this case, it was opened up in the form of an auction to a variety of providers of fixed services who could compete in the context of the auction to offer service on condition of meeting the public service obligations associated with receiving that service. It was also open up to a variety of speeds so that a provider and applicant in the auction could come in and propose to provide service at one of 4 tiers, starting at the bottom at 10 megabits per second up to a maximum of 1 gigabit per second. Bidding closed in that auction on August 21, 2018. About $1.5 billion in support was awarded to participants to provide service to close to 700,000 locations in 45 states. as of, so, and just a bit of background on how that works. So the auction takes place, the bidding occurs, there's competition, there are winning bidders. And then after the auction, those winning bidders file post-auction applications that are more detailed looks at their capabilities. And when those what are called long form applications, post-auction applications are granted, then the support begins to be dispersed. So I should mention it's 10-year support. The term of support in CAF phase 2 is over a period of 10 years. It's as of May 14th of 2020, we had authorized 1.44 billion of the for 631,000 of the locations in the 45 states. There's just a little bit left that we need to address. It's a 10-year funding period for that program, but the deployment period that the providers have is a 6-year period. So they have in the 3rd year after they begin to receive support, they have to provide service to 40% of the estimated number of locations in the areas that they won on a statewide basis. And then that increases each following year until you get to year 6, where they have to reach 100% of that amount. And so there's, if you're interested in that auction, there's more info at the link there. The more recent activity in the high cost front is in the connection with the Rural Digital Opportunity Phase 1 auction. This, as was the case with CAF Phase 2, it's a reverse auction format, followed the prior format very closely. There were a few differences based on some lessons learned in the first go round, but largely tracked the same format, which seemed to be a very good way to disperse this type of support. In this case, one of the changes is that the available speed tiers started at 25 megabits per second up to 1 gigabit per second. The bidding in that auction closed last November, and it resulted in awards of $9.2 billion in support over a 10-year period, covering 5.2 million homes and small businesses, which was 99% of the areas that were eligible to receive funding in that auction. So there was a lot of interest, a lot of competition, and a lot of the support was accounted for in the bidding. Reached 49 states in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands in terms of the scope of it. I should note that the location, while the range of speeds that could have been proposed in the auction started at 25 megabits per second, the actual winning bids almost exclusively were at least 100 megabits per second or up. So despite the availability of the lower speeds, it was not what ultimately was successful in the bidding. So currently we are reviewing as I mentioned earlier, the post-auction applications associated with that auction. So once those begin to be granted, in CAF Phase 2 were granted on a rolling basis as they're processed, and I would expect that to happen again this time. And once that does start to happen, then the funding will be dispersed. And then that triggers the commencement of the deployment period, which is slightly different from what was the case in CAF Phase 2, in that there is an 8-year period that they have to get to the number of estimated locations at the end of year 6, which is the same as CAF Phase 2. But by year 8, based on improved data on broadband deployment, there will be another assessment of the number of locations in those areas. And between years 6 and 8, those winning bidders will have to reach any locations in those winning areas that won support that were not accounted for in the estimated number of locations. And so there's more information about that auction at the bottom bullet there. And so that takes us to broadband data collection, which I've touched on. So in order to fund broadband effectively, we need to know where it is. And we are working very hard to improve the current broadband data collection, which is, you may be familiar with, is FCC Form 477. That data has been used for a number of years. It's been useful for in the sense that it was the first of its kind to have a comprehensive account of broadband deployment, but it was collected on the basis of census blocks. So in other words, a census block was shown as served or not served, which is not very granular. And we don't have information within those census blocks as to what specific locations are served or not served. And so the point of the broadband data collection that we're developing now is to correct for that issue of the granularity, but it also has a number of measures to ensure that the data we collect are even more accurate than what we collect now. I should mention that the Form 477 is good at showing where there is not broadband deployment, but it's not as good, not as precise when it comes to showing where there is broadband deployment. And so the CAF Phase 2 and the RDOF were based on data about where there is not broadband deployment. So with this new data collection, which I'm getting ready to talk about, we'll have more precise information about where specific locations are or are not served. So in March of last year, Congress passed the Broadband Data Act, which required that we pass rules to collect location-specific information about broadband deployment. And as I mentioned, this will involve more granular reporting. So it won't be in the form of census blocks, but rather in the form of shape files that specifically cover or don't cover locations that could receive broadband. So the shapefile, when a provider submits a shapefile under the new collection, it will submit a shape that can be overlaid onto a map that shows where its coverage extends and where it does not on a location specific basis. For fixed broadband service, providers may also report, rather than shapefiles, they may report the specific addresses or locations where they have service. And for mobile broadband service, which is also comprehended by the new broadband data collection, they will file specific propagation maps showing where their networks are capable of reaching consumer devices based on specific technical parameters that are prescribed in the Act and in our rules. Another important element of what's required by the Broadband Data Act is the Broadband Data Fabric, and this goes to the fixed broadband services data. So what it is it doesn't exist yet, but it will be a comprehensive database of all locations where broadband could be installed, or either is or could be. And so this will be the measure, the foundation upon which provider data will be assessed. Providers will report based on where the fabric shows that there is or is not a residence or a small business that could receive broadband service. And so it will be a very big improvement over where we are currently with the deployment data that we have. The Broadband Data Act also called for the use of stakeholder input to include a challenge process. So when a provider submits broadband deployment data, the public, other stakeholders can come in, will be able to come in and challenge that assertion by the provider, and it will be subject to a process that we've developed to result in a determination as to the accuracy of what the provider reported. This is also a new feature of the data we believe will help greatly in fine-tuning the maps of deployment coverage to understand what's actually, to get a sense and see what's happening on the ground versus what's reported to us. There's also a crowdsourcing element, which is a less formal means of gathering information. It still would come from stakeholders such as consumers and others, but will not be subject to quite the same formal process, and will be used more to inform our understanding of the broadband deployment data that may be used to inform investigations or other analyses of the broadband data. And finally, we are required to accept verified data from state, local, and tribal mapping entities for inclusion in the new maps once they're available. There's an enforcement and audit function that will also improve accuracy and reliability. And then finally, we're required to create public maps of fixed and mobile broadband availability. So what we're creating will be largely there will be very little of it that won't be available to everyone for their use. So we will use the data for our purposes, policy making and other purposes, but they'll also be available to other stakeholders, the public and others, to evaluate and make the uses that they want to make of it. So just a quick timeline on that. We adopted some rules on that last year in July. We received funding for the IT platforms necessary for each of the elements of the new collection in December. And in February of this year, the chairwoman created the Broadband Data Task Force, which is a special unit within the Federal Communications Commission that is tasked with overseeing the extensive implementation process associated with this data collection and the maps that will come out of it. And so currently we're engaged in the process of procuring services and other products to implement these databases and taking other steps to implement the data collection. We have a new website that gathers information and makes it available to the public concerning our efforts on the broadband data. Unfortunately, I can't get into the timing of it. We're working as quickly as we can to get this up as fast as we can, but I don't have any specifics on the time frame for this. Oops, sorry. Just one more look at this. So, oops. This gives you a picture of the data flow that we will be dealing with under the new collection. On the left side, we got provider data that will be an input, the local government data, tribal data, other federal government data. We expect to incorporate third-party data under certain circumstances, and then the fabric will be an input. We will have processes that ensure the data quality of the data that we get, including validation, technical assistance to filers, challenging crowdsourcing processes and audits. And then the outputs will be improved public maps. We'll be able to more precisely target universal service funding, and we'll have better data for our work. So those are the highlights that I wanted to cover. Happy to talk about that or other things if those are on your mind. I may not be able to answer every question today, but I can get back to you if it's something that I can't address today.
Thanks very much, Kirk. That was unbelievable amount of great information, and really appreciate you taking us through these different programs. I think I had a question that I thought was interesting, because we're reading different things in the trade publications about the mapping, the broadband mapping, and you brought this up, how you're going to be doing the mapping. We've heard reports of maybe 4 months to do the mapping, up to maybe 2 years to do the mapping. And, you know, it's hard to say, because I mean, this is a huge project of how to do the mapping to really get granular about, you know, which places don't have broadband, et cetera. Any ideas of, you know, how is it going? I mean, 4 months seems really too quick. I don't know how you could do it in 4 months, but any, you know, from your vantage point, what you're thinking?
Yeah, so I can't address specifics on timing. I will say, you know, it is a very complicated process. There's a lot going on. We've made quite a bit of progress already, but there's a lot more to do. Got a great team of people who are devoted just to this issue, just to the implementation of the maps, understand entirely the importance of the data to us and others. So we also, though, want to get it right. We want to make sure that the data are reliable and that we and others can rely on them. So that's a balancing, a tension there between the two interests that we're working very hard to manage. But yeah, definitely recognize the importance of getting it out there quickly. It can't happen quickly enough as far as we're concerned, and putting a lot of effort into that.
Yeah, I think we had one question come in, but I also had a similar question. Did you look to other countries who have any other countries in the world done this in a way that you said, hey, we need to look at their model of how they did it? Or were there any states that did, you know, good modeling on coverage?
No countries. I have a feeling we're in the lead on that. I think even the 4477, for all its issues and shortcomings was the best there was, in my opinion. You know, but we need something better. But that, I think we were, you know, in terms of having a resource, it was quite a good one, and now we're going to have an even better one. We do talk to the states quite a bit, and states some states are very active on this front, have learned some really good lessons that we've been learning from them. But some have not done any type of mapping in this regard, so it's kind of a mixed bag. But yeah, we definitely drawing on that resource, staying in touch with states, hearing from them, and want to learn all the good lessons we can.
Great. And maybe I should call on Bill Spruill because he's been very involved here in Texas on broadband. So Bill, maybe you can take a question.
Sure. Kirk, so I was appointed by Texas Governor Greg Abbott last year to chair his Broadband Development Council. And we made recommendations to our legislature, which are now actually being codified into law regarding development of a statewide broadband office, a statewide broadband plan, a fund, and of course, mapping. So we are anxious for the mapping because, as you know, it's a fairly inaccurate science right now, and we need to get a lot more granular. By the way, on other countries, you might take a look at South Korea as a really great example of a country that's done a good job of broadband deployment throughout their country. And the Pew Charitable Trusts have got a specialized group that focuses on broadband policy, broadband deployment, and we have really relied upon them. Here's my question. So, you know, we've got all the different funds you talked about. In fact, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration says there are no less than 53 separate broadband funds headquartered out of DC. The Appalachian Regional Commission's got one, USDA's got one, DOD's got one, FCC's got a number of them. And on top of that, you've got broadband funds that have been made available ostensibly through the various COVID relief bills. You know, there's for state and local governments, there's a combined 190 million for states and 130 billion for, I said 190 billion for states, 130 billion for local governments for infrastructure, which can be interpreted to be broadband. How do we coordinate this in a way that there is an efficient and reasonable deployment of all that massive amounts of capital to deploy not just broadband to unserved areas, but also to address the affordability and the digital literacy issues where you've got access to broadband, but people either for whatever reason can't afford it or they don't understand it?
Yeah, no, great question. It's something we work very hard at. We coordinate with our sister agencies who have those programs. We formally and informally, we work very closely with USDA and RUS on their programs so that we're continually feeding each other information about what we're doing and making sure that they have the latest available information. They're one of the bigger players in this space, and on the federal level, certainly know folks at the Appalachian Regional Commission and talk to them. They're part of an interagency group that meets regularly to talk about these issues. And we talk informally as well as formally on these issues. But it is a challenge. You need to continually work towards it. And as we fashion programs and other agencies fashion programs, we work to try to make sure that we're staying out of each other's way to the extent that makes sense. In some ways, we complement each other. A lot of what RUS does is complementary to what we do. And so we're able to work in conjunction with one another. Our programs can work in conjunction with one another. But yeah, it's a constant effort that needs to be made to make sure you're getting it right.
Well, and you've got a lot of different state players that are involved, a lot of local players, a lot of private sector companies. I was pleased to hear you say that a lot of the awards out of the RDOF 1 round went to providers who were doing better than the 25-3, because one of the things that we believe is that the FCC needs to update what constitutes a broadband speed. We really need to get to 50, 10, and if all possible 120, because 25-3, just doesn't provide the bandwidth, frankly, particularly in a remote learning environment with all the different, video and applications you've got to get there. So I assume that, part of the decision making in that RDOF reverse auction is that you're looking for scalable technologies, and you really don't care you're technology neutral with respect to what the actual deployment is. Is that correct?
That's right. It's about, but speeds and latency are favored in the RDOF, but not technologies.
Right. Yeah. For us in
And Kirk,
Texas,
it seems like I don't think anybody who was a winner had a 25.3. The latency and speed was like, a lot of them were super fast fiber speeds.
Yeah, overwhelmingly. I'm not going to say nobody. I think there were a few within less than 1%.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but it was almost all 100 or better. I think, I don't want to get this wrong, but I think it was over half were gig speed.
Yeah.
Is there a breakdown of the, which technologies were won in the reverse auction between, say, fiber or a fixed wireless solution or a satellite solution? Was that kind of breakdown, or is that breakdown available?
I don't know that so that information is ascertainable based on what was filed with the FCC, with the short forms, which is the pre-auction applications. We don't have it packaged, I don't believe, but it can be ascertained if you take a look at what people applied for.
Well, it's telling in terms of kind of the regionalization of our broadband deployment plans, particularly for a state the size of Texas, where what works in East Texas is not going to work in West Texas or South Texas. They're completely different geographies, different densities, different topographies. So,
and that
it would be
really, it's part of the rationale behind the structure of the auctions, both CAF Phase 2 and RDOF, was to have not to prescribe one speed or one type of technology, but to say, look, it's going to depend on the area. We'll let the market participants, the auction participants, decide what makes sense in that area and allocate the money that way. And it seems to have been a very successful way to go about it.
Former Chairman Pai had an idea for what I think was called a 5G for Everywhere fund. Is that still on the FCC docket, or where is that?
There is an open docket on that. We are working on that, but don't have anything I can report on that right now.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Barbara, I think we had a request for a copy of the slides. I don't know, Mr. Burgee, are you able to share those?
I can share those, yeah.
Perfect.
That'd be
Thank you.
fantastic. Be looking forward to those. All right. Anybody else? I can't see if there's other questions. Bill, can you see if there's other questions for Mr. Burgee?
I do not see any.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was super informative, and we're looking forward to maybe in a few years from now where we can say we have fantastic high-speed broadband for every American. So thanks very much, and for all the work that you do in your service to the FCC.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just want to remind the audience that we resume our federal policy briefings tomorrow with Senator Cornyn. He will be on at 11 o'clock our time, Central Time. And then at 12 o'clock, we have Representative Van Taylor. So it's the same Zoom link. Come back in, and we're going to have some fantastic briefings tomorrow. And then Thursday, we wrap up with our good friend, Representative Pete Sessions at 9:30 in the morning. Barbara, thank you so much. Mr. Burgee, thank you so much. Everyone, we're adjourned for today. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.